Shout out to our guy, Rob Demovsky. Why don't you bring in your buddy here, Hogue? Look at him.
Our guy, Rob Demovsky, joining us here on the CHGO Bears Podcast. Saw Rob at Lambeau a couple weeks ago. If you're wondering why I was so optimistic on the Eagles taking care of business last week, it was because, my conversation with Rob. He didn't seem too confident about the Packers in the playoffs. So, and you were right, Rob, as you always are.
Well, I don't know about always, but thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, so yesterday we kind of covered the Dallas Cowboys years of Mike McCarthy, and it runs so much deeper than that. So I'm thinking we got to talk more about Green Bay, and there's so much time to cover. Going back, I mean the Mike McCarthy, Aaron Rodgers roller coaster was a remarkable one, and I think in a lot of ways very relevant to what he would be offering Caleb Williams. So, Rob, you covered his entire time there. I just thought you'd be the perfect guest to bring on. So I guess let's just start with this. Like, in general, like, how do you sum up that time? Mike McCarthy, Aaron Rodgers, how do you look back on that? Obviously success with the Super Bowl, failure towards the end. But overall, I mean, it worked, right?
Yeah, there were almost like 2 or 3 segments of Mike McCarthy's time with the Packers, because you got to remember, Adam, the first 2 years were Brett Favre, right? 2006, 2007. So if I can start there real quick, in 2005, Brett Favre threw 29 interceptions, and they were 4-12, and Mike Sherman got fired. They brought in Mike McCarthy to get Brett Favre back to being, Brett Favre again. And the next year, they went 8-8. He cut his interceptions, I think, down from like 29 to 13. And then the next year, 2007, they go 13-3. Probably should have been in the Super Bowl. Lose to the Giants in overtime in a freezing cold NFC Championship game at Lambeau, where Favre's last pass was an interception. All the while, he had 2 years of working with Rodgers off to the side. He obviously didn't have Rodgers his first year here, but 06 and 07 he did. And, Rodgers went out and played a game and filled in for Favre, and Favre got hurt in a game in Dallas late November of 07, and Rodgers nearly rallied him to a win. And I know McCarthy and then general manager Ted Thompson walked out of Dallas that night thinking Rodgers is ready. So, and I say this because, his work with quarterbacks is probably what his bread and butter is. Now, the only difference, or one difference, between what they did then versus what they can do now is just time with the quarterback in the offseason. I mean, McCarthy has this, he calls it his quarterback school. I've sat in his office and he's pulled up videos of Joe Montana going through offseason workouts in his quarterback school, when he was with Kansas City way back under Marty Schottenheimer. But the problem, Adam, is they can't start that in February like they used to in the old days because of the limited offseason workout. So, McCarthy's still a really good quarterbacks coach, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for getting Aaron Rodgers rolling. But it's not, he can't quite have the impact that he used to simply because there's no time for it. But that's just one little tiny segment of the McCarthy era, and it went pretty well until it didn't, if that makes sense.
Well, but I'm glad we're starting there, because I feel like looking back on that whole time, we sort of now look at Aaron Rodgers as just like this Hall of Fame quarterback. Like, oh, he was always destined to be that guy. Maybe he was, but it's always interesting to me talking about Mike McCarthy, in that he was actually in San Francisco as the offensive coordinator when the 49ers passed on Rodgers, who was the hometown kid, in favor of Alex Smith. And one of those reasons was Mike McCarthy, and he wasn't the only one concerned about this, but they were worried about his mechanics, his release point, and how high he held the football. If you go back and watch him at Cal, he used to hold the ball up near his helmet. It looks so weird now to think about. And they never felt like he was going to be able to change that. But that was one of the first things Mike McCarthy did with Tom Clements, who, by the way, just retired yesterday. But he brought Tom Clements in, and they fixed that relatively quickly, right, Rob?
Yeah, he's really good with mechanics. He's really detailed. I mean, and whatever you think of Dak Prescott, Dak had one of his best years in 2023 when McCarthy took over the play calling. So, that was so weird, Adam, the Jeff Tedford Cal coaches, they all held the ball way up here. And, those guys that came before Rodgers didn't really do well in the NFL. And there was sort of a concern about Jeff Tedford and Cal quarterbacks. But, there's a lot of revisionist history about the, San Francisco picking Alex Smith and all that. But, McCarthy was so far down the food chain on that decision making. Mike Nolan was the head coach. It was such a weird. It's such a weird thing because it depends on who you believe on who made that decision. But ultimately, Mike Nolan, I think, made the call, and it was obviously the wrong one. But I do know that when McCarthy got here as the head coach in 2006, one of the first things that he said he did was sort of, address that elephant in the room with Rodgers over the fact that he was on the staff in San Francisco that passed on him.
Rob, the Bears have at least according to the players, they want this alpha dog. They want somebody who's going to hold everybody accountable.
Yeah.
How do you think McCarthy would do as far as that part of the job?
That's a good question. Having not been around him on a daily basis for the last 6 years now, it's hard to know, how he is in that regard now. For a long time in Green Bay, he was a pretty good disciplinarian. He would hold guys accountable. I think toward the end, maybe it got away from him a little bit, but I saw you popped up there was a comment on the screen about what the average record of McCarthy in Dallas is 10-7, and the Bears is what was it? I think it was 5-11 or 6-11 or whatever it was.
It's just bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Mike McCarthy is, and this probably doesn't answer your question because I'm not really sure what he's been like as a disciplinarian of late. But in my opinion, if you're, there it is, 10-7 versus 6-11. If you are a team like the Bears and you want to get to 10, 11 wins and get back in the playoffs, I think Mike McCarthy is a tremendous hire, especially if you have a young quarterback that needs coaching and needs to be shaped. Now, is Mike the guy who is going to take, a 10-11 win team and take it to the Super Bowl? I mean, I'm not saying he can't, but that's maybe not necessarily his specialty. But I don't think that's the situation the Bears are in right now. So I think that's why he would be a really good fit there for a number of reasons. But that's one of them.
Well, I got to say, you're really starting to have me turn the corner, and I think a lot of fans that are kind of trying to keep an open mind to this, obviously we all have our blinders or tunnel vision to Ben Johnson. He's the darling of this coaching class, right? But this is really interesting stuff. So if you're saying, all right, quarterback development, check, roster, holding team players accountable, culture, check. I guess the third question for me is, within the organization, how he is dealing with a front office and an organization like the Bears, where he's been used to the Green Bay Packers and the Dallas Cowboys, who have had a little bit more, consistency with making the playoffs and being successful.
Right.
Whereas here in Chicago, it's a mess.
No, it's a good question. And one of the things that I think Mike is really strong at is creating a culture. Now, that's a big cliched word, but Mike's a planner. He's organized, things like that. The interesting thing is, you say, and you make a good point, like organizations like Green Bay and Dallas, but those organizations are so differently set up that I think, I do think that he's adaptable to being able to work in a different setup. Think about Green Bay, there's no owner, right? Mike McCarthy basically had to answer for everything in the organization. And the general manager for most of his time, Ted Thompson, never liked to be out front. And for better or worse, like Mike had to stand up there during all the Brett Favre stuff, and whether, Favre wanted to come back, they didn't want him back, and he had to answer all the questions. And I remember Mike telling me at one point during that year that he was out of coaching, saying, my next opportunity, I would like it to be where, I'm not the only voice of the organization. And well, he went to Dallas, and maybe that was the extreme, right? That's the complete other end of the spectrum, to where he had Jerry. And I bring up the differences just because, he's been able to work, under different types of structures. And I think, I think he's done pretty well. I think if I were hiring Mike McCarthy or interviewing Mike McCarthy as a coach, the only thing that I might, want to know is how does he plan on evolving his offense? Like, what's the next step for the Mike McCarthy version of the West Coast offense? Because, it did seem like toward the end in Green Bay, it didn't necessarily evolve and maybe didn't stay ahead of the curve. And I'm not sure if that's what happened in Dallas or not, but that would be my question for Mike is, you've been doing this a long time. I assume you're not just going to take the folder from the Packers game in 2021 and change the date to 2025 and there's your game plan, right? Like I would like to know from Mike's standpoint, just, where he sees the next evolution of his offense.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And I heard that on the Cowboys side of it too. It's just, it seemed like that West Coast offense got a little stale towards the end. But maybe every time you change a job, that's kind of a thing you're forced to do, is to kind of revitalize it. So I guess my next question for you is more towards the end and what went wrong, because to ask you a really layered question, why weren't the Packers able to win more than one championship with those two together, which I'm sure you've talked about endlessly over the years, but and then who was really more to blame? Mike McCarthy, Aaron Rodgers? It just didn't end the same way it started.
Right. So fair question, Adam. We could probably take 24 hours and still not run out of things to talk about in that regard. I'll just give you a quick example of, they win the Super Bowl in 2010. They go 15-1 in 2011, and then they lose in their first playoff game. They had a really good chance to get back to the Super Bowl in the 2014 season. And if you remember, that was the 2014 NFC Championship game against Seattle, where they had were they up 16-7 with 4 minutes to go, and Morgan Burnett picks off a pass, and Julius Peppers tells him to just get down, and he does. And so the next series, the Packers go 3-0 in that series. They had a rule going into that game, according to multiple sources, and I've written this on ESPN.com, so it's out there, but I think it's worth repeating because I think it speaks to whose fault it is. The first play of that drive, they had a rule going into that game, the whole game, that wherever, I think it was Michael Bennett, wherever Michael Bennett's lined up, the quarterback makes an automatic check to go run the other way. Well, the first play, Rodgers hands it off to Eddie Lacy. They run it right into Michael Bennett, -4. Okay, now it's 2nd and 14. So now the play McCarthy sends in it's a run pass option or the check with me or whatever you want to call it. And it was should have been an obvious check to a pass, and Rodgers ran it. Now, no gain. Now it's 3rd and 14. They don't get it, and they punt. And McCarthy gets absolutely skewered in the post-game press conference and weeks after for taking his foot off the gas. Well, here you come to find out, somebody told me this probably 6 or 7 years later, and I was able to confirm it with multiple people that were involved in that coaching staff, that that's exactly what happened, right? So now whose fault is that game, right? Aaron, people want to say the Packers didn't do enough for Aaron Rodgers, and I get it. They never drafted a number one receiver in the first round. They didn't sign free agents. Totally fair. Maybe McCarthy's time management cost them in some games. But there's also plenty of instances in which Aaron Rodgers cost them games. And I bring that up as an example just to illustrate, the head coach quarterback dynamic is so much more complex than anybody realizes, and I think when you're together as a coach quarterback for that long, it's hard to keep it fresh. And I did say this after well, first of all, let's go back to the year that Mike got fired. I think they started 3-1 or 3-2. They had a shutout of Buffalo in week 4 or 5. It was 22-0. Mike had just hired Mike Pettin as his new defensive coordinator. The story of that postgame was going to be the Packers' first shutout with this new defense. And instead, Rodgers goes up to the podium in his postgame press conference and said, keep in mind, they won 22-0. He goes, we were an embarrassment on offense. We should have had 60 points and 600 yards. The game plan was terrible. And I walked out of the press conference and I looked at Pete Doherty from the Green Bay Press-Gazette, and I said, man, he's trying to get the coach fired. And that's exactly what happened. Now, fast forward to his time under Matt LaFleur and Rodgers. There was a game in London, 2022 season. Rodgers didn't like how they traveled to London. He thought they should have gone earlier. Didn't like after they lose the game. Didn't like what LaFleur had said to the team about don't let one loss turn into two. He thought, why would you even bring that up? And I remember talking to him as he's walking out of to the buses. Me and Matt Schneidman from The Athletic were talking to him, to Rodgers, trying to clarify, what were you talking about, things said in the locker room. And after that, I looked at Schneidman and I said, man, it took Rodgers 8 years to get sick of McCarthy, and he's already sick of LaFleur after 3.5. So this isn't to bash Aaron Rodgers. It's just to illustrate that sometimes what coaches get blamed for is not necessarily always what it appears to be.
So one more just down the Rodgers lane here, because Caleb talks about Rodgers being his favorite quarterback. If he got on a call and said, Aaron, what's it going to be like for me if Mike McCarthy's here? What's your best guess of what Aaron would say?
I think that's a really good question, because I think now, here we are, 7 years after the last time they worked together. I think Aaron would probably say that, Mike's really good to work with in terms of, teaching you the fundamentals. But I think, had it been early on, my guess is it probably would have been, Mike's stubborn, Mike doesn't listen to the players, or maybe things like that. So I just think there's, the feeling has probably changed a lot for Rodgers. The Cowboys played here. Was it Rodgers last year here, or the second to last year? The Cowboys played here. And if you listened to Rodgers that week, you would have thought Mike McCarthy was, his best friend and long lost brother, the way they spoke. And I know they had a moment together before the game. So I do think that, I would guess that Aaron's feelings about Mike would be, for the most part, pretty positive. But you guys know Aaron a little bit and can see how he operates. I'm not sure. Who knows? It's so unpredictable what he would say.
Yeah. But bottom line is, it sounds like you
should they hire him, Rob?
You
feel
like he'd be a good hire.
Yeah, without knowing what Ben Johnson would want to do. I mean, look, that would probably be the number one hire. Excuse me, if you could get him. But without knowing what he wants and the situation there, like I said, if I were, we'll just say the Green Bay Packers right now, and I had won 10, 11 games, but I just couldn't get over the hump to get to the Super Bowl, I don't know that I would necessarily hire Mike. But if I were a program, an organization that desperately needs a culture change and desperately needs to become relevant and winning and contending again, I don't know that there's a better guy that you could pick for that situation than Mike. Like, I really think that's right up his alley.
That's probably why they're so interested.
Reggie, you in?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I just don't know if I can trust Rob, because he's,
Rob,
Packers guy.
He's from Arlington Heights. He's from here.
Just don't know if I can trust him.
I'm one of yous guys.
Did you dunk on Green Bay at all with the way they cheated in the blocked field goal game then, Rob, this year? Did you point that out to anybody that was illegal and the Bears should have swept the Packers? Did that happen anywhere?
It was brought up, actually. We did ask Rich Bisaccia, the special teams coach, if he thought, they broke the rule. Of course, he's going to say no. I don't know. Did the Bears cheat when Brian Robinson blocked that punt a couple days after Walter Payton's passing and won the game up here at Lambeau? You guys remember that game? I think the spirit of Walter was lifting him up. And
that's not illegal.
That's not illegal.
That's a supernatural.
You can use spirits.
I'm just kidding. Hey, I was a freshman at Rolling Meadows High School when the Bears won the Super Bowl in the 80s. So it does not matter to me who wins or loses. I just want to see a good story.
But speaking of good stories, I loved hearing, or at least seeing on Twitter, that you were standing up for bald people everywhere in the press box the other day in Philly, because that was unacceptable behavior by those Eagles fans, and you were not going to take it.
So there was this. Have you guys been to Philly? The press box in Philly. There's it's actually a pretty good location in terms of being low. It's like between the upper and lower deck, unlike Soldier Field or Lambeau Field or everywhere else where we're 8 million feet in the air. But the only downside to that is that the fans that are at the back end of the lower level, like, their heads are right at about eye level for us, like where our computers were working. And so these every year in Philly, the fans they turn around and they bang on the press box window because, and I don't know how the Bears do it because they have an actual owner, so they probably sit in an owner's booth. But for the Packers, like the team president, the GM, all the scouts, all the front office people sit in the press box with us, like on the road. So right behind me are Brian Gutekunst, the GM, Mark Murphy, president, and Robert Saleh, who has been consulting, for the Packers since he got fired. And Robert and I share the same barber. And this woman was so intent the entire game on trying to get Robert Saleh to notice her for whatever reason. She kept banging on the glass, yelling at Saleh, and he's sitting right over my left shoulder. Finally, like at the end of the game, like it's coming down to the end, I got to file my story that posts at the deadline, and she's just right in front of me screaming. And then she just starts, for whatever reason, when no one would acknowledge her, there's me and about 2 or 3 other bald reporters on the beat. She just started going, "You're a bald MFer. You're a bald MFer. You're a bald MFer." And I finally just banged on the glass, and I go, "Sit down and shut the blank up." And I didn't turn around, but on the way out of the locker room, I'm pretty sure Robert Saleh kind of gave me a little bit of a wink, a little bit of an attaboy for shutting that woman up.
That's hilarious.
Because Rob's a long time Chicago guy. That's a shout out to Les Grobstein, R.I.P., who got up and would scream at fans outside of the press, like, "Sit down!"
Hey, you guys know this, but people don't realize the press box is a quiet working environment. Like fans probably don't understand that, but like when someone yells, "Sit down and shut the blank up" in the press box, it's gonna get some attention. And
everybody's gonna notice that. I just wish I'd been there for it.
I wasn't like, if Schneidman would have asked me if you wanted me to tweet it or not, I probably would have said not, but I don't really care.
Well, I'm glad he did, because that was a great story to share on this show. Rob, thank you so much for your time today, man. Always appreciate it. And by the way, Rob does outstanding work too with the Vaughn McClure Jeff Dickerson Foundation, which is why I wore the hoodie today as well.
And I would have worn mine, but mine's in the wash, so I haven't had a chance to do any laundry since the season ended. So I was going to wear it, but I do have my coffee mug with the foundation. So
I had that mug in our office here, and someone broke it, and no one has fessed up to it.
Wasn't me.
Greg?
Sure.
Nope.
It's probably that woman from Philadelphia.
Yeah. Rob, thanks so much, man.
All right, guys. We'll be seeing you.
We all silly like the mayor.